and welcome to the second in our series of security talks. I'm Britt, and today we're going to be discussing the military secret to improving your operational security using IPCE. Okay, so here's a quick overview of the topics that I'll be discussing today. We'll just start with the problems that are happening right now, both for organizations and how organizations are protecting their own network. The intelligent solution that I'm going to offer you today, which that is IPCE. And then I will discuss why IPCE is relevant to these security issues that organizations are facing. And finally, the benefits that your organization can receive if you choose to implement IPCE in your organization. So also, as a little housekeeping, if you're attending this presentation through our Excel events platform, you'll want to, and if you want to receive CPE credits for your attendance, make sure that you answer the 3 poll questions as they pop up throughout the presentation. So there's always a problem that every organization is trying to fix. And some security issues are most likely keeping your ISO up at night. Now I understand that the 4 bullets on your screen are kind of an oversimplification, but we kind of needed to start somewhere. And I summarized the problems that many organizations are trying to fix, or things like protecting their people online, avoiding ransomware, safeguarding their intellectual property and data, as well as avoiding seeing their company's name in the headlines due to a data breach, right? And as a CIO or ISO, I might need to somehow come up with a way of achieving those 4 goals while still staying within my budget, right? And even if money isn't a problem, you still need to decide how to protect your organization, which could be perhaps deciding which security appliances to buy or how to implement network security, like where to place a firewall. And then there's monitoring, responding to security alerts, incident response, the list goes on and on. And I believe that there's several issues that organizations face when trying to deal with these security concerns and I think that to start out briefly covering the topics that I see as maybe the top 4 concerns that companies might face when trying to address those problems I just spoke of. Now, first is the most glaring issue, and that's that there's no one way to protect your organization, and indeed there really shouldn't be, right? Every industry has their own special flavor of concern, whether you need to secure HIPAA, or you have to protect your industrial control systems, or maybe you've been tasked with protecting critical infrastructure with the state. So, number 1 bullet is there is no single solution for a very complex problem. So, where does one begin in maybe, trying to remediate that issue? If you were a wise CIO or ISO, we might look first at an overarching security methodology based on existing frameworks or federal standards that can be implemented in your workplace. And I understand that going this route isn't exactly what comes front to mind. I know if you've ever tried reading the NIST 853, it exactly isn't a speedy read. So, there's other options out there, right? There's the CIS Top 20, but like pop quiz, can you name, the 6 basic controls off the top of your head, right? So maybe even that is a little bit too advanced for some or maybe more mature than some organizations can achieve. So that's the second bullet. The third is, I think, a common pitfall that many of us fall into, which is relying on that emerging technology versus something that's a little bit more tried and true. And I know that there's this, big rush that comes when you procure a new security appliance that maybe other big name companies or organizations are investing in. And maybe you go and buy something because, hey, there hasn't been any negative press lately, so why not invest in this, new type of technology, right? And while sure you might get, some pleasure in turning on all of the bells and whistles and seeing those alerts popping up, but essentially that bleeding edge of technology can really come undone by more low tech and easily avoidable concerns like, or more practical methods, like enforcing policy or having your security personnel trained, because everyone knows that people are the problem 9 times out of 10, right? So it's that, emerging tech versus a more traditional method. And then this last point actually kind of leads nicely into my last bullet, which is relying on machine learning versus the more human intelligence side. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive because I said people were the problem, but really employees and those existential threats that you can't control are the problem, right? And while utilizing machine learning is, in some capacity is of course useful and informational, when you have your dashboard that's just like full to the brim with threat feeds and just like multiple exclamation points just popping up all over, you need to have someone behind that screen, right? Looking at the data and trying to determine what actually is happening that is affecting our organization in what capacity. So we've looked at the problems and we saw those overarching issues that many companies are facing when trying to manage their security programs. And now comes the part where I tell you, how to do these things better. So to start off, having a security solution that instead of, isn't cookie cutter out of the box, that it's in fact tailored to your environment and your unique business requirements, right? So there is no one way of doing things, and that means that a better solution is have a tailored program that is specific to your operational environment and meets whatever business requirements that you have in your organization. Now, putting on my small business hat, maybe I just want to make sure that my small organization can make and build and sell widgets without my website going down. And then also preferably not losing my client's trust and having a data breach or exposing their personal information. So those two security requirements right there, right? Like having my website up and not losing personal information. A lot of organizations are going to also have those similar requirements, but never with the exact same levels of exposure or maybe the same geographic area as you, or maybe not even the same market type. So tailored to your organization. And number two, another maybe a more mature way of handling these security issues is using a cybersecurity model. Now, first we need to know what the heck a cybersecurity model is. And very simply, it's just a way of identifying and responding to security risks using a standardized, structured, and repeatable process, right? And you might actually already recognize a cybersecurity model that's been used to investigate and classify threats like MITRE ATT&CK. Or maybe it's in response to intrusions and breaches like the cyber kill chain. So I'm going to introduce a third model here pretty soon, but for now, just know that using any cybersecurity model still beats the method that I call just hunt and peck, right? Which is just randomly investigating alerts as they pop up. Or maybe just skimming that top layer of vulnerability, because when you're looking at your vulnerability dashboard, you have these 99% vulnerability score that are just like juicy red, and you just want to handle those first. But unfortunately, that can become overwhelming and you never get past that, 90% threshold. So moving on to bullet 3, we're going really deep. And bullet 3, identifying threat landscapes. I say threat landscape, but you might say organizational boundaries, right? Or your network perimeter, or even the entire state of California. And again, this is going to be dependent on your organization, but in order to protect our business, we need to know where we're looking. Otherwise, how do we know what we're going to protect? And I think it's important to keep in mind that threats aren't always as they seem, right? So what's a major existential threat that we're facing today everywhere globally? So COVID, right? And not many would link COVID and security together, but when you put it into the realm of a cyber attack on a COVID hotspot, like say Los Angeles currently, and you put ransomware in a hospital, now that attack is looking more like costing human lives, right? So when you put it into that perspective, there are some major existential threats that face organizations that aren't specifically cyber related. And then finally, we come to testing, right? And I know the idea of testing is beaten into every ISO's head, but it's actually like so important when it comes to just validating that all of the time and effort you put into your cybersecurity operations are paying off in the end. So having that repeatable process that allows us to check and see if our incident response plan is effective, or maybe just having the ability to probe the outer defenses of our network, can really make a world of difference. Okay, so we finally reached IPCE, and I finally get to tell you what it is. So IPCE is Intelligence Preparation of the Cyber Environment. And as you can see here, I actually didn't come up with this name. And if you search for it, you'll find several iterations of this same idea, all based on this original concept of intelligence preparation of the battlefield. And the Army developed this in 1973 as a way to essentially provide predictive intelligence to those commanders and generals in the field, and it actually played a major role in tactical planning prior to a battle, right? So the Army definition of intelligence preparation of the battlefield here is quoted in blue, and it standardizes tactical intelligence analysis through the use of graphics, and that's simple enough to understand. And those graphics are used as a template to aid in the analysis and means of disseminating intelligence. So there's still a modern form of IPB used today, and that's used jointly with several other branches and intelligence professionals around the globe. And they use IPB in its modern form to evaluate those external factors like political, economic, infrastructure, and then they apply those considerations to the specific operating environment that they're going to be, there might be a conflict in, right? So they take political, economic, and they apply it to operational environments like terrain, weather, enemy tactics, defense. And that's going to help determine the most probable enemy course of action, right? So kind of going back to my second slide where I mentioned that some of the issues that we have is using that, bleeding edge of technology, and rather we should focus on this tried and true method. And you'll notice that the core method of IPB has actually been around longer than I have. And in fact, the quote that I took here from this uh, was came from an Army regulation and manual that came out the same year I was born. So I'm not actually Army, thankfully, and I'm not Intel yet. But I can see security from like this 10,000 foot view. And with the help of our actual Intel experts at Taborda Solutions, we've been able to come together with this intelligence preparation of the battlefield developed for the cyber environment. And as our VP of Security, Justin, mentioned, he says that a lot of people have had this idea of applying IPB to cyber, but no one's really made it work yet, right? And so that's where we come in with this new cyber version of IPB. And the definition that you see here in the bottom actually comes from a SANS talk about 3 years ago, and it was first. It's actually the first search result that you'll find if you Google IPCE, and the quote is kind of a mouthful, right? And it's the definition is a systematic, iterative process of analyzing the means and motives of our threat actors within our digital environment. And we do that to understand likely scenarios in which we will face threats, enhancing our operational resiliency and security. So I'm going to break that down a little bit to make it a little bit easier. And we start with iterative and systematic, right? And as you'll see shortly, IPCE goes through the same 4 steps over and over again. And the purpose of that is to really dig into the hows and whys of securing our environment. And when we look at analyzing the means and motives of threat actors, here I believe is the biggest difference between using intelligence versus the standard mode of operation, which is relying on security alerts and threat feeds, right? So rarely are you going to hear like a level 3 analyst say something like, what do you think their motivation was for breaching our network, right? Generally, they're just going to ask, like, how did they pivot or where are they going to strike next? So I think understanding the motives is really instrumental to moving to that more intelligence plane. Now, the next part is understanding likely scenarios. And this is actually the final result of the IPCE 4 steps. And generally, it's what a smart CIO is going to be asking for rather than just like, what is our number one vulnerability, right? So the last bit, enhancing our operational resiliency. And that's, again, looking at those more external global factors that may not otherwise have been considered when just looking internally within your own network. And I'm going to go into more of like a thought experiment here in this next slide to help you kind of more understand what we're looking at. So I promised that I would break this down into 4 steps that can be easily followed. And first I'm going to go over, steps 1 through 4 in a more textbook manner. And then I'll introduce it in a little bit more of a graphical story mode. So step 1 of IPCE is defining that operational environment. And while this is an oversimplification, essentially we need to visualize our cyberspace components and those threats through various layers of cyberspace. So we're looking at the physical and logical network, including your network bounds, but also extending past. And then looking at cyber personas, and you might know these as threat groups, as nation states, APTs, advanced persistent threats, essentially those external and internal threats. And then we have civil considerations, which are things like our external services and the effects on threats like COVID. And then finally, we've got our internal and external considerations, which I can summarize these as things like supply chain, our external infrastructure, so like the state, internet service providers, and then maybe things like cloud. So all of those 4 bullets create our operational environment. It's everything that we live and breathe in their entire environment. Now, step 2 is in defining the environmental effects on our operations. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take those 4 bullets and see how the environment is going to affect all those things. And a very timely consideration to be made today is, what if my data center resides in Texas? And did I factor in the possibility of a freak snowstorm basically crippling the entire power grid, right? So taking down all of my business operations. And I don't think many organizations, had that in their forethought that, hey, within the next 10 years, could we potentially be down for weeks at a time, right? So that's a good example of an environmental effect on our actual operations that we have no control over. So then in step 3, we're actually going to evaluate our cyber threats. So whereas 2 is looking at those environmental, number 3, we're actually going to do the rubber meets the road of cyber threat hunting. And that includes looking at maybe traditional threat feeds and then analyzing those well-known threats. But again, looking specifically at threats that fall within our operational environment. And we use a threat model to accomplish that. And here I've just listed a couple, those 2 common cyber kill chain and attack. And then we're going to introduce a third model, which is the diamond, and I'll get to that shortly. So essentially we come to step 4, which is developing those threat courses of actions. And here we're putting together steps 1 through 3 in order to determine essentially how the outcomes of those 3 steps and the numerous variables within our operational environment impact possible threat operations. And we need to look at all of those possible attack vectors so that our CIO knows where to dedicate their resources. And I'm going to kind of walk you through this little thought experiment here by using those 4 steps. And we'll start with step 1, we'll isolate it here to make it a little bit easier to see. And first we're going to just, put on our small business hat and go through and define our operational environment. And maybe that includes doing some really easy things like step 1 of that CIS top 20, which is creating an asset inventory. That could be our hardware, that could be our software. And then because we had never done it before, we started, just listing out competitors within our industry or our market, and just kind of just knowing who might be a potential threat to our business. And then we're going to maybe collect all of the disparate logical maps and network maps that we have scattered around our shared drive. And we're going to put them together and try and look at a more holistic view. So those are the first 3 steps that we take as a small organization. Next, we're going to take the results those products that we created, and start looking at them and see what might those 3 products, how will that affect our organization? And help it make a more intelligent decision on which threats that we're going to try and mitigate. So maybe the results of looking at those network and logical diagrams is that we found out that all of our Internet of Things devices are actually on the same network as our point of sale. So that's probably not great. And then because of the timeliness of the Texas storm, basically actually the whole Midwest, maybe we need to start looking at how weather is impacting our physical infrastructure. So that's just a consideration that we take into place. And then after looking at our newly updated asset inventory, we determined that we haven't actually covered all of the things. We've discovered that our inventory is incomplete. And that right there is going to be our intelligence gap. So at this point, Instead of going back to step one, we're just going to note it and keep moving on, right? Because this is an iterative process. So once we've gone through and we've kind of looked at the operational impacts that these products that we've created have on our business, now we can actually start evaluating the potential threats as they relate to our specific organization. And because we have this point of sale terminal and we have a Internet of Things devices that are sitting on this VLAN, maybe we're going to look at which cyber threats existing that target point of sale terminals. And again, we can use something like the attack framework and help us really define and hone in on those POS terminals. Once we've looked at the potential threats that exist, we can discover which tactics, techniques, and procedures, those TTPs, that those threat actors like to use. And we can actually see what potential indicators of attack or indicators of compromise we might see on our own network based on those TTPs. So we're going to review those network logs and we're going to see if any of those exist. So that's pretty easy to do because, we're being proactive and we actually are logging those things. Fourth step, now we're going to start building a potential threat profile of potential actors. So we know that these lists of threat actors target point of sale terminals, and we know what their TTPs are. And then essentially, if we do actually find an indicator of compromise within our network logs, we can now correlate them and attribute those actions to a potential threat actor, right? So at the conclusion of step 3, we've actually been able to put together these two most likely courses of action. And the most likely course of action that we've come up with was an attack by an organization like Fin6, and maybe they're utilizing Ryuk to target our point of sale terminal. Based on our analysis, that is the most likely course of action to be taken against our specific organization. And because we can't just leave it at one course of action, we are also going to look at the most dangerous course of action. And to us, the most dangerous would be not just getting into our POS and maybe stealing that customer payment card information. Maybe then they're dropping ransomware as well. And after they've exfiltrated all of those credit card numbers, they're now going to lock us out of our terminals just for good measure, right? So the way that we were able to come up with those most likely and most dangerous course of action, is by using the diamond model. Sorry, that one didn't come out. So let's talk about the diamond model. And we've gone into depth with steps 1 through 4. And I want to hone in on just step 3, which was that threat modeling, and using it to basically evaluate our cyber threats, and then have maybe a more simple way of describing what a security event looks like within our organization. So this is the diamond model, and in its simplest form, it helps us describe how an adversary deploys a capability over some infrastructure against a victim. And again, this diamond model has been around for several years, I believe since 2012. And it was created by the Center for Cyber Threat Intelligence and Threat Research in order to help better analyze intrusions as they happen. So we're going to kind of briefly go over this, but looking at their actual white paper is going to be your best course of action in order to really understand how the diamond model is used. This is very much a high-level primer. So first, we've got an adversary. And as anyone knows, an adversary is an actor or organization that is responsible for utilizing a capability against the victim to achieve their intent. And in this case, an adversary's intent might be anything from, dropping malicious software, or exfiltrating data. So sometimes threat actors might be a sub to an organization, or they might be just a lone wolf kind of, script kiddie. Doesn't matter. And then we have capability. And capability here actually describes the tools and techniques of the adversary that's used, that the adversary used in this event, whatever the event is. And TTP here is our tactics, techniques, and procedures. So we have our TTPs and our adversary. What is infrastructure? So infrastructure here is described as the physical and or logical communication structures that the adversary uses to either deliver that TTP or maintain control of their capabilities. And in this case, it would be like a command and control or a C2. And then also affect results on the victim. And in that case, would be like exfiltrating data outside of a network. And then again, we always have a victim here. Sometimes it's an inadvertent victim, and sometimes it's a maliciously targeted victim. But they are the target of the adversary and against whom those vulnerabilities and exposures are exploited. And then capabilities are used against. So we're going to kind of just show how the diamond works. And to start off, we have an adversary that is using infrastructure against the victim, right? So we're going in this kind of carrot. Additionally, an adversary will develop a capability to use against a victim. And obviously, you can't really use a capability unless you have that infrastructure. So here we can see that a capability is being deployed via infrastructure against our victim. So in this case, infrastructure is connecting to our victim, as well as a capability is being exploited against the victim. So this is a fairly simple, high-level example of how the diamond model can be used against an organization. So let's run through a quick thought experiment on, again, our previous example of exfiltrating credit cards against an organization. And we can just kind of run through what the adversary looks like. So if we have done our intelligence steps and we know that Fin6 or maybe a similar adversary, it's going to be financially motivated, and they're going to be harvesting credit cards against our organization in which to sell, let's say, on the black market, right? On the dark web. So here, it doesn't matter really who our adversary is, we just know that they're malicious. And having done our intelligence homework, we understand that they're going to have specific capabilities or TTPs that are going to be exploited against us. And the infrastructure of choice is going to be our point of sale system. So as we move through our 4 steps here, maybe we've gone through once and we've already defined that we understand that our point of sale is the most likely point of attack. We're not going to stop there. Obviously, we're going to go back to step 1, and because we've identified this intelligence gap, we're now going to do a more concerted effort to update our inventory asset. So we've done an updated inventory of all assets, and we've discovered that not only do we have Internet of Things devices, those Internet of Things devices are actually a vulnerability. There's several vulnerabilities inherent with them. So our next logical step is to separate those Internet of Things from our point of sale network, right? So not only are we identifying the vulnerabilities, but now we can have a more targeted and logical change that are being made on the network, instead of just saying like, well, let's put more firewalls in front, let's just put more protections. No, it's really easy to just move those IoT devices outside the point of sale network, and now you have reduced that threat landscape. And that's not something that would apply universally to any organization. That being said, we can then say, okay, now that our Internet of Things are no longer on our point of sale VLAN, how has that modified our threat, right? So then we return to our diamond model, and we can say definitively that that threat landscape has changed. We no longer have the infrastructure which to use, that the adversary can use against us, and exploit our network, right? So not only are we using the diamond model to identify threats, we can also use them to lessen our threat environment. Okay, so you might be thinking, wow, this looks familiar, right? Well, it should. These are those intelligence solutions we spoke of before, but now we're going to quickly wrap them back around into IPCE. So looking at the first one again, tailored to the operational environment. Well, just look at step 1, right? We're going to define our operational environment. We're going to make sure that we know exactly what exists inside and outside of our network, which is considered our operational environment. So definitely IPCE fits the bill on this one. Number 2, we're going to identify that threat landscape. That's step 2. We're going to look at those existential threats that exist all around us and see how they affect our operational environment. Now, step 3, we're going to use our cybersecurity model. We introduced the diamond model, and that showed us how it can aid us in evaluating those cybersecurity threats so that we can more easily create those threat courses of action, right? And then finally, in step 4, we're taking the most dangerous course of action and putting some protections in place, and then starting to do some red teaming, right? So in our previous example, maybe we were able to harden and protect our point of sale network. And then we're going to ask our buddies who are red teamers to try and break in. And if they're able to, then again, we iterate once more, we make some more protections, and we test those vulnerabilities. And the same thing goes with maybe doing incident response. So this is something we did within our own organization, where we did some tabletops for various incident response plans, and then we test them and see how we can respond better, smarter, quicker, right? So all of those intelligence solutions to our initial problems that we had can all be solved using IPCE. So now that we're nearing the close, let's just briefly discuss a couple intrinsic benefits that you can have just using IPCE in your own organization. So first off, it's scalable, right? It's extremely scalable, actually. In its simplest form, it can be accomplished by a single individual in some capacity, and which can actually yield the potential results of having an entire security team at your disposal. So one member of your security team applying IPCE can actually have more benefit than a larger team. And then actually conversely, IPCE can be easily integrated into an existing large-scale SOC operation, or in place of less effective threat investigation methods that you could be currently using. Next, because of its iterative nature, IPCE is really great for identifying problems and processes that might not be working for you currently, just because you didn't have the right means to investigate them and to identify them as not as optimal. In the intelligence world, we call this the OODA loop, right? So it's observe, orient, decide, and act, OODA. And again, we're going through this process, again, with the testing, like I mentioned earlier, and we're going to be looking at it from a different perspective every single time. And it's something that we as human beings do every day, like we correct ourselves if we're feeling off balanced, but now we're just applying it to our security practice. And this next bullet should make every ISO very happy, which is IPCE has a very low threshold to entry, as the only asset you really need to pay for is the time from a security expert that can help you implement it. And depending on the size and the complexity of your own environment, IPCE is the type of decision that actually might cost you more in the long run should you choose to not implement it. Because as we know, the cost of responding to a data breach just keeps going up and up. And then finally, now I might be biased, but I think IPCE is really great, mostly because it's the kind of approach that can be applied in phases, right, over several years. And you can either do it all at once in a huge paradigm shift, or gradually, right? And you just keep starting to incorporate more and more portions of IPCE into your own organization. So even if you choose to start implementation with just a single piece of the intelligence pie, or you're benefiting from the entire whole enchilada, you're going to get some form of benefit no matter what, right? So what does that mean to you as an organization that maybe is wanting to get more information, right? So like, hey, we definitely want to learn more about this, and we want to start maybe implementing this in our own organization. Well, I'm going to drop some links into the chat here, and it's going to basically have our contact information, and you can reach out to us at any time, and we're more than happy to have a conversation with you and your team about, how does IPCE work for our organization, and how can Tabora Solutions help facilitate that? So I'll be hanging out with the rest of the team for the remainder of the event, and I definitely encourage you to visit the Expo Center next, especially if you stop by all of the other booths, because we will be having a Sudoku puzzle that you can solve and win amazing prizes. So definitely reach out to us. We're happy to help, and thank you so much for attending this presentation. It just makes me feel so happy that you can listen, and happy to help in any way that we can.